Okay, we are recording.
Here we go.
Okay, let's just
Were you thinking Bitbucket or Visual Studio Code?
Visual Studio Code probably would be the place to start. Let's just walk around
Okay.
in some of this.
Clean this up.
Look at the different kind of files. Let me show you some of the content.
There.
I want to just let's see. Do you want to try to start at the top level directory, or we can start in Angular, which is under that web app apps directory. We can just look at some of these files at the top level and just I'll just kind of talk through what some of these are. They're down at the bottom. I think most of the files are because those are directories up there.
Yeah.
Um, tsconfig.json. You can open that. Let's start with that one. That's TypeScript configuration. You usually don't have to look at this, but all these that are .json, .json is good to understand. It's just a format of information where a group of things have a squiggly bracket before and after them, like the whole thing. And then we have compiler options is a name, colon, and then there's a parentheses, a squiggly bracket open, and then there's one somewhere down further that ends it for all of the compiler options. That's the overall one, but there must be a corresponding one like on line 2. There's a open squiggly bracket. Line 21 must, no, that's it's before that there must be a closing squiggly. Oh, line 24 ends compiler options. See how it lines up with compiler options conveniently? They tend to put the first bracket on. That's like beginning and end. So it's a group of things called compiler options. It's just information. It's a group of compiler options is a group because it's got that squiggly to open and close and to make a group. Target, each of these are individual properties, like kind of like variables. But this is not a program, it's just information, just a grouping of data. And so that is used when we build and run things by the TypeScript compiler that converts actually TypeScript syntax into JavaScript when we build the software. But so target is a name. The value, the simple part is like this down here, colon, it's a label, colon, value. So you got target, colon, ES5. That is actually, ES5 is the official name of JavaScript, of the current JavaScript standard. The ES is, I've heard ECMAScript is really the official name of JavaScript. So that's just saying it uses JavaScript version 5. ES5 is really the official name. And then the new syntax, because eventually there's going to be an ES6 that you may see in some videos and stuff. That's actually ES6 is a lot more like TypeScript syntax, the programming language, because it's evolving and adding things to it. But until ES6 is a standard, we have TypeScript as a programming language that gives us a syntax. So anyway, this is just configuration in TypeScript, but JSON is typically like this. You've got variable, comma, value. You've got module, colon, common, JS. We don't care what most of these are really, but source map, true. The possible values for things that are true are probably true or false. The value is good. Notice the thing like are somewhere in quotes, like the target is ES5. That's a string value of characters, ES5. Notice that source map does not, it has a value of true with no parentheses around it. It's a data type of Boolean. It's a variable of type Boolean that can be true or false, and that's it. Strings can be any text, and they have quotes around them.
So how do I know? Is there like a page that ES5 like is connected to?
If you Google for ES5, there's a standard and a document and everything that defines the JavaScript language. And there's books that'll talk about JavaScript. They'll say it's ES5. This is just used by the TypeScript compiler. We usually don't need to look at this. But JSON itself, we're going to look at several JSON files, and it's used in many ways as just a way to use data, provide information for different purposes. And the main thing about JSON, so the main thing I'm teaching here is just JSON structure. And so it's defining variables or values for it that are then used by the TypeScript compiler. Is the one that uses this particular file. Okay.
Yeah.
So like outdir colon target www app. That's a output directory. It's a directory that TypeScript uses for something. I don't know what. Target is usually where we put the code that we build. That's probably where it puts the JavaScript under that directory. There's a directory target www app under our code probably. Let's see, we got a target. You can go scroll up and find target. It's not something we check into Bitbucket because it's generated code. It's code that's generated when we build. It's like a temporary directory. Target is usually a temporary. Target is the language type there, a compiler option. All these possible name values would be defined by the TypeScript compiler. If you go to search for TypeScript on a web page, you'll find, all the definition, and you look for TypeScript configuration or something. It would have documentation that defines all of these and what they're for, if you ever care, if you ever have a need for it. I've never really had to look at this before. I just know it's a JSON file, and it's used by TypeScript compiler because it starts with TS. And some videos will talk about that and say it's used because it has TS config. But the JSON syntax is pretty simple, fairly simple, but there are some things you need to get used to looking at it. And there's a lot of places where you end up looking at JSON syntax where it says, here's some data. And if you have an opening and closing bracket, it's called an object. It's just a grouping. Like compiler options is an object because it has brackets that begins and ends, so it groups stuff. And then you got individual fields that have a name in parentheses because it's a string name. And then the value may be a string, depending on if it has quotes, which means just text, or a Boolean, could be true or false. There's a few other possible values. Integer is a type, I believe. Numeric, it is, I guess. Look at one other syntax to know about JSON is look at lib. Lib has this square bracket around the values with a comma between them. It's a list. There's a list of libraries for some purpose used by it. Ooh, specify libraries found. Hey, cool. The Visual Studio Code is actually showing you the documentation for the name of these options right there when you hovered over it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But notice type roots also has square brackets. They just formatted it on multiple lines for some reason. Just they felt like it. But it's square brackets is a list, but there's only one thing in that list apparently. But if you see square brackets, it could be one or more in the list. And type roots, I wouldn't know unless you hover over it what that's for, but it doesn't matter. It's got one value, one string in quotes, one text value. Same with apps /star paths. Look at includes. See include down on line 25. Include is a variable called include, is the name label, and it's a list because you have square brackets and there's commas between it, and two strings which are paths to directories. It looks like. So that's JSON syntax is the main thing about that. We won't go through every file like this. JSON lint. Lint is usually, let's open that briefly. JSON lint file down there. I don't even know what's in it, but I know that lint typically is for historical reasons, means check the syntax. It's actually, these are settings to say it's going to check our TypeScript, which is our Angular code, against various rules. And it will tell us when we build, give us warnings and say, well, you're not following standards. You should put your brackets here. You should have spaces before and after things, just whatever various syntax rules that are not required to run, but are things we do for make them more readable. So lint is usually to check for quality, an automated little program typically that will check it. So it's checking TypeScript for standards. As part of the build process, and here's a configuration of what we wanted to check for. Let's, the README, let's jump around. README MD file, let's get the TypeScript AOT, that's just another config file for TS config in a certain part. Various settings, looks about the same, doesn't it?
Yeah.
In fact, oh well. Um, stuff for the TypeScript compiler. I've never, JHipster generated these originally. Somebody had to understand them, but or anyway, I don't have to usually look into those. README file, is markdown syntax.md is markdown, and you've looked at that and you've learned a little bit about markdown syntax. It's pretty useful, pretty simple syntax, but pretty useful to understand. I'm going to start jumping around. More important ones, package.json. Package.json configures your Angular, is a required file for building and running Angular code, which is written in TypeScript. Those files you've looked at before. But see all the dependencies here on line 10. This is all JSON configuration, that information that we need, because it says here on line 10, here's all these other JavaScript packages named at Angular/common, Angular compiler, Angular core, and specific versions that it uses that we require. And that's why you do a yarn install command that runs the build. It pulls down from the web, from websites, these versions of these other packages. So we got all this other code that's used, for different purposes, like the ng bootstrap that we were playing with. And the little up arrow in ng bootstrap, in the version, it says little up arrow thingy, 2.0.0. It's all defined in the package.json standard for what it wants. The version values here for things like this are up arrow means just this version or higher, 2.0.0, or if there's a later version, that'll be okay too. Things like that. So this is good to be aware of, because once in a while, like we did with the ng bootstrap, you have to come in and add an entry when you want to integrate another JavaScript package that we want to use the features of into our project. It's a bootstrap thing. The one file below it is pom.xml. Over in the left, just right below package.json. The syntax is XML. It's a general syntax. It's a lot like HTML, but for a different purpose and a little bit different rules. But it's got this bracket stuff around everything, right, that you define. This is used for configuring Maven. Remember, we do Maven wrapper to run the Java code. This is like, so package JSON is the kind of the build definition set up for Angular. Pom.xml is the setup from the Java point of view. It's been around for quite a long time, and it's defined in a syntax called XML instead of JSON syntax. It's just a notation to define things. And we're defining properties there, Java version 1.8 on line 18. And you put the name of the property. This is a little more verbose or wordy, and it's why people like JSON syntax a little better nowadays. XML used to be more popular, but it still works. And then it has a closing /java.version. That defines the beginning and end of this property, java.version, and the value is in between it, 1.8. If you scroll down some, but this is what the Maven wrapper requires. When we run that .maven wrapper, it looks at this and knows how to build our Java software and run it. There's a lot more in it. Scroll down. Once in a while, it's good to know how to get in here. You often don't need to, but scroll down. There's a dependency section. That's usually one of the most important things. Here's the Java libraries that we're pulling in from the internet. When we build, Maven goes out and pulls these down for us. And the versions are not specified here because they're specified somewhere else, up above in those properties, or in these properties, or go on, scroll up. So POM means project object model. It's a definition of the project structure. Is why it's called a POM. POM project, my project of a Java project. Object model, it's the model or definition and structure of your project is what it intends to be. If you scroll all the way up to the top, there's a parent. Is there a parent? properties, property repository, package version, artifact group. No, I guess not. I guess this is where it's getting the versions. Anyway. All right, so you don't need to know too much more. There's a bunch of dependencies here. It's Java configuration. You know, if we ever have anything we need to do with that, with Java configuration, this would be a place to start.
Okay.
We don't need to look in the other ones, but you know, there's the MVNW. That's the /Maven W. I guess we could open it. I guess you could open it. It's just it's a program. It's a script. It's a short little script program, Linux command line script that tells Linux, the command line, the operating system, to run our code. And run Maven, and Maven will look for pom.xml and go do all these commands. The Maven w.cmd is if you're running on a Windows machine. That's how you make a command script for Windows, DOS in the Windows environment. So that's how somebody would, they won't, if somebody's got a Windows machine, they'd type run Maven w.cmd because that's just how it works under Windows instead of /Maven W. But those are commands to start our build process and tell the operating system to run this code.
Okay.
Angular.json, I'm not sure what that is. Another all these JSON things that are sitting in this top level directory are configuration stuff used for something. I guess it's part of the Angular. I don't know why. If that's the Angular CI, so let's skip that. Things with a dot in front of them are hidden files, or things that you usually don't need to look at, and are often used by tools or generated or created by tools. Good one to look at though is git ignore. It's good to be aware of that in terms of Git. This says, you know, there's some code some things that get generated when we build, like temporary directories and stuff, that we don't want checked into Bitbucket, because when you run the code on your machine, we'll get a temporary copy of these things that get created. And when I run, I'll get a copy. We don't need to check those in. We only want to put into Bitbucket, you know, code that we write, that we need to keep, what we need to in order to build the software. So it's a pretty useful file here that you can start sticking other files in the directory, but you don't really want them. If you don't want something checked into Bitbucket, you just stick it in the name of it or a path to it. It's a way of specifying a path where star means anything under this path. Says, you know, ignore them. This says Git will ignore them and not try to check them in for you, or say, hey, these are checked out, or do you want to check these in? It'll skip all these. These are files we don't care about. We don't want to keep under version control. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's get past those now. So Webpack. Let's open. That's a directory. Webpack is good to just be aware of. We don't need to go in and look at the files very much, but know that this is an important part of. It's also kind of similar, along with package.json, to the build setup for Angular. It's part of the build setup for Angular, which kind of like Maven using the pom.xml. It's got some fancy stuff in here that that Yarn uses to build our software. Thankfully, JHipster puts those files there for us, and they work, and you usually don't need to get into them. But it's good to know what Webpack is, that it's a part of the build setup for Angular when we try to build and run the software. So most of our code, as you know, basically, it's good to be aware of the node modules directory. When we do a yarn install, it downloads all those dependent JavaScript files from the internet, and it puts them in this directory called node modules. So all that code from the internet that we need to run our software, like there's ng bootstrap, and it's got a directory and it's got files. It's got tons of files in here. It's a lot of stuff. It's just temporary. All this, you can delete this directory and then do a yarn install again, because that's what yarn install does, is populate this directory and pull all those down from the internet for us. and put them in this place so that we can run our code. But it's not something we want to keep in version control. And so git ignore is set up to ignore this directory. You can delete it. You can put it back. It won't be, so it won't be there when somebody first sets up the computer, but you run yarn install and they all get put there. But that's where all that third-party code is. It's kind of good to know that sometimes. Okay. Just shut that. Don't worry about any of the other files that are little files laying around here. So most of our code's under source. Let's go into Angular code. So source, src, main. Our convention is source main or source test, because there's test code that we haven't looked at and we don't need to yet for a while, that we can use to test our code. But source main web app is where Angular is, because that's the web application, the user interface of making a web page. App is the convention for the top level directory for Angular code. And so under Angular, can you widen that bar a little bit in the Explorer? Just scroll somewhere there, we'll let you drag, yeah. So you've got app.module, app.main, app.constants, all TypeScript files, a few other files, app route module. Main is kind of like the boot. Main is just start the software. This is when you do yarn start. This what tells it what code to run. Notice looking on line 12, it has this command. Bootstrap module means the one to start initially to start the software. It's go home notes app module. If you go into app module file, app module.ts, you'll see a go home notes app module defined down at the bottom. Oh, it's just here all the way at the bottom. It's a class. It's got all this configuration above it, no code in it actually. But that's where it's defined at. All this stuff goes with it, with the ng module and configuration and stuff. It pulls things together. So the main just refers to this. It's just plumbing to say that's how Angular works to get it started. If you start with Angular books, it will explain this and tell you to go put this code in a app main.ts. So Angular has this concept of modules, grouping of things that they call modules, and that's why it's called app module.ts. And app module.ts is a top level code for Angular that represents the whole web application. It's the top level piece for the web application. And that's why up above on like line 27, scroll up a little bit, it has import. So we're the app module imports these other modules. Go Home Notes core, Go Home Notes entity. Look at the last one, Go Home Notes entity module. We've gone in there and we had host request was under entities. Notice that typically, not always, but typically the convention is they usually make a directory for every Angular module. So typically an Angular module is typically related to a directory. So we have a Go Home Notes entity module, and in the left you have an entities directory. The naming conventions are a little different, but right. There's a Go Home Note. So if you go into why don't you open that entities directory? So modules are a grouping of files in Angular, and and then you got the physical files that are put, and then there's modules inside of. I don't know if these are modules unless we go in there and see the definition. Directories may or may not be exactly the same as modules. Why don't you open school since your cursor's on it? Is there a module file in there? Yeah, so it's a module. So we got a module called entities, and that module has a bunch of nested modules inside of it. Modules can have modules, just like directories can have directories below them. And see, the file name is school.module.ts, and here on line 23, it has something called Go Home Notes School Module. So they have part of the same name. Their conventions, I don't really like this, that they prefix it with Go Home Notes. I don't understand why they needed to do that. It's just the way that JHipster generates it. I expect if I've got a file called module school.module.ts, then I expect to find something in it called school module because the file was school module ts because it's a TypeScript file. But usually you define classes in a file in Angular, and I expect to have the same name, but they put go home notes school module.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's a clear, pretty consistent relationship. That module, notice up above, it has to import all these other things which are in that happens to correspond to the files in that directory. School component, school details, school update component. So in Angular, modules are groupings often related to directories, but it's a grouping of things. And components, everything in Angular, everything on your user interface from Angular's point of view, when you display a web page, is a component, is the concept. A whole web page is a component. And part of a web page could be defined as another component. Because if you have the same kind of fields on several web pages, you might want to reuse that and make it one component that could be used on several web pages so you don't duplicate it. But the main thing is you got modules, which are grouping of things in Angular, and then you got components, and components relate to, make it simple. For the most part, and generally speaking, a component relates to a web page. And when we go to a web page, when we're clicking around, it's not always completely obvious right off which is which from a web page point of view, but there is a place where you can delete a school, and this delete school dialog component is likely the code that gets displayed and then says okay and does whatever it has to do to delete the school when that happens. School component is the way their convention in how they did it with the JHipster generated code. School component, I believe, is the listing screen. I don't know why they didn't, I may eventually, once we get more comfortable with this, start changing some of these conventions, because if it's a list of school components on that screen, I might have called it the school list component or something like that, or schools with an S. But they would call it the school component, and that's the main one you come to that lists the things. School details is the school update, I think, component is the one that we edit, where we add or edit an item, the form. And school detail is the read-only view, which maybe should be called school view. It's no more detailed than school update, but you can just view it, but you can't edit it on that page. But so you can start getting around in Angular by following the modules. App is the top one. Otherwise, directories are groupings, and there's a module file that has some definition. And then, but every screen is going to be a component. And if you widen the Explorer window on the left, notice for every component file, there is a related HTML file. There's a TS component file and there's an HTML file. So TS is what? What kind of code is in a TS file? Yes. Once you open one, not that one though. That was, except for index, it's a kind of special one that just lists all of them. I forget why they do that, but so this is JavaScript code or TypeScript code, which is effectively JavaScript with some special extra syntax for actions that you can do on the screen. This is the behavior on the screen, and we make a function for each. There's a clear, there's a confirm, delete. So when the user clicks a button, which is defined in the HTML, HTML defines the layout of the screen. You can look at a web page and then you can compare it to the HTML, and you can see pretty much where it comes from without knowing HTML too much. But there'll be references in the HTML to confirm, delete, and it will call this function. That's a function like in math that does some processing. It's a group of code that can be invoked by name. You see, this is a delete dialog. That's about the only action on it, I think. So code is in the .ts files to do things to manipulate and provide behavior on the screen. HTML is the layout of the screen. There's a module. Let's see, there's a, what else? We might want to talk, there's a route file. So stop me anytime if this is, if this doesn't make any sense to you or something.
This file?
Yeah. So actually before we look at this one, scroll down and see if we can find an index.html file. Scroll down in the left in the Explorer window.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. See, that's outside of the Angular code. That's outside of app. This is the only HTML web page. HTML is what browsers really know how to display. Those other pages are under Angular are really partial HTML chunks. And so this is really the only real web page right here. And see line 20?
Yeah.
This JHI, they happen to have named it that since it's JHipster, I don't know why they named it main. So that's their convention.
Why would they have start and end something right there? Like why can't I just take it out then?
Because this is how they hook Angular into HTML web pages. It's just what you got to do to get Angular to be hooked into the HTML when you display a web page. HTML requires you to have a closing. You could have actually just put /closing, I think, but typically you wouldn't do that. It's because this is the point of integrating Angular into your HTML, just the regular HTML stuff, which is what browsers know how to actually use. Browsers know how to execute index.html. Some of this other stuff that comes from Angular, it doesn't know how to do right off. So this is the place. If you go, that JHI main is defined. See, most of these tags are defined by HTML, and browsers know. You can look up in the documentation, and any browser knows what body, head, base, meta, title is the title displayed on the page.
Yeah.
This one doesn't have a lot of interesting stuff, but all of that is defined and managed. It's not specific to Angular. It's HTML. It's stuff you can put in a file and a browser will display or use as defined. If you look up the documentation for this, there's a lot more to it that says here's how what HTML can lay out a page. It's a markup language like Markdown in a sense, but it's for displaying web pages, and browsers interpret it. But we're hooking it in because so the Angular can now manipulate it and work on it. If you go back to main app, if you go to app, the top level Angular,
yeah.
Notice there's an app. There's down below. You passed it. There's an app module. I think it's in. Is it in module? Open app module. Oh no, I think it's in. Okay. No, it's got to be in a component. Components are the only. Go see home. Home is the home page. So go to home. I think it's under home. Go into home component. I think that's component. Component.ts. Sorry, I wasn't specific. There you go. Look at no, that's JHI home, not main. I forgot where JHI main is. See line 8, selector. So you learned from CSS that there's selectors, things that you can identify things in HTML by. CSS uses selectors as classes as the way that CSS gets hooked in. So selector says this can be referred to in HTML as JHI-home. So you can put the little thing, but there's a JHS just main somewhere. How about layouts? Layout is a layout of the page with the header, footer, sidebar in the directory on the left. There's a directory, there you go. Main. There's a main layout here under main component.ts, these TypeScript files say, how can you link this into HTML? Line 7 is the name, JHI main, and that's what's referred to in index.html. And then if you go into so this is some code behind it. It's just a little, nothing too interesting here. Get page title. I don't even know. I've never had to look at this before. It doesn't do a lot here of functionality, but you need a TypeScript file. Look at the corresponding HTML file, main component.html.
Why is there 2 of everything?
Because HTML lays out the web page. That's going to be put into, that's going to be replaced with that's going to be put into the browser to lay out the page. TypeScript doesn't display things directly. TypeScript cannot, browsers will not display JavaScript or TypeScript or anything. You know, if you work with JavaScript, can change things, but it cannot directly display stuff. HTML does.
So what's the
point HTML?
Of TypeScript? So what's the point of the TypeScript?
Well, let's find a more interesting one. Let's go back up to teacher or one of those under entities and look at a TypeScript file under, or the delete that you were in, any of those under here, a TypeScript file for one of the screens. Yeah, update, that'd be good. Delete any of those with the TS. So look at these things, scroll down. They've got functions in here. See a save on line 57. So this is what we do to save a new teacher record when you enter it. Some code has to be executed to make that occur. Over here, yep, scroll down here, you'll see a save button that lays out down at the bottom. Yeah, that last button. It's named save. That's just the name of it. Scroll to the right. Somewhere here, we'll have a reference to that save function. Save. Scroll back to the left. I don't see it. Maybe it's by name. I don't know how it knows in this case. Scroll up to form. Scroll up. Is there a form? Error message, form, group. Yes, line 3. See, there's an HTML form. So this is part of learning HTML too. There's a form says layout fields on a screen for input, like, you know, a form on a web page. When you go to enter a text box in the drop-down list and you enter stuff and you click on a checkbox, for those to be grouped and used in the software, you need an HTML form that says, look, these things are grouped together, you know, as input when you get input from the user. And notice over there, it says, what do you do when somebody submits this form, basically. This is defined by HTML, not on line 3, but over there's a ng submit equals save parentheses on line 3. Next to the right, towards the right, ng submit equals save. Save parentheses is calling that save function over there in the TS file. So this defines the layout of the page here in HTML, and it has references to say when the user clicks on this button in certain ways here, you know, execute some code. And the code to be executed has to be in a TypeScript file. Could have been JavaScript, but we're using TypeScript. You know, but HTML cannot execute things. It can just define the layout. It says, look, here's how the page is displayed, because that's what browsers understand. That's how technology works. But we need to do something to take this information, verify, check it, maybe, and send and store it for later, right? We need to store it when somebody enters a record to update or changes the teacher information. The code that gets executed to do some processing is in the TypeScript file.
Okay.
Okay, so every screen, bottom line is that to remember is that in Angular, for every web page that you look at on our running application, our web page, there's going to be a component in Angular. Component in Angular consists of 2 files, an HTML file and a TS file. if there's for TS does any processing that we do when you click on different things if we want to. And HTML defines the layout of the page. So if you want to mess with the layout of the page or anything, you'll be going into HTML. If you want to change what we do when we save something or whatever, you'll be going into TS and starting to try to understand this better.
Okay.
So and on the way this code is structured, all of the application specific things that we have is under entities. But there's some other general stuff like the accounts code and stuff. So now you're getting into the, yeah, so it's under app module. Content is other web page stuff like images, and that's outside of Angular, but this is all Angular code under app, and it has HTML and TS files. They have components relates to a page. In Angular, you have these modules in Angular, but it's just kind of configuring a group of files together, and it doesn't directly relate to displaying stuff. It's just the organization within Angular.
Do I need to know all this before I can make any changes? If I go to issues and stuff, like how is important if that I know all this stuff?
Well, we were trying to, we could go back now and look at the change we just did make. We added that type ahead field. So you wanted to display a text box. We wanted to change what was displayed. So we did go into HTML file. At least you then know you need to go into HTML. But it needed it to do the type ahead processing when you start typing. That was code we had to put in the TS file because that's processing. It's, you know, dynamic behavior. So you started needing to know where to look at least, and then you have to understand these better and better. Over time, you need to understand this syntax a little bit better and what's going on here, what the class, what the function, you know. HTML is a little bit easier to understand, and it's more related to CSS than just the layout of the display. But it's not that hard once you start looking at it. Filter the go home notes by date. That's processing, so that will that would be done. Well, we might need a field on the display too. A lot of these will involve some change to the display, some change to code, either in JavaScript, in the TypeScript, or maybe in the Java as well, which we haven't talked about now. I suggest we don't get into right now. But eventually the JavaScript calls passes control to Java and passes information to it.
But I need to do it to learn it. And what is this? Would this be HTML or the TypeScript?
Change the other student selection on host requests. Change the other student selection on host and guest request forms. Oh yeah, that's what that number 9 is the one that, yes, that's the type ahead. So I didn't describe it very clearly in number 9 there, but that's the type ahead we're trying to do.
So so that's somewhere in here.
That was in the host request. We're in host. That's not. We're in host guest match request thingy. Host request, and that was on the update page. Actually, it's what it's called here. And so, see, I still left that code at the top. I got that code working at the top. I don't know that I did fix. I don't remember if I fixed it on the student actual field or not. But see that we added this stuff from line 5 to line 12. And that's what put a text box up there with that text that we got off the other page. And when you start typing, if you scroll to the right on line 12, on line 12 we have this last thing, NGB type ahead equals search. And if you look in the documentation for that thing, which we don't need to do now, it's called that. It's calling a function in the TypeScript code called search. So if you go over to the TS file, you'll see the behavior that when you type, it's an Angular defined thing. We just had to go read about it, and defined by NG Bootstrap framework, which is a framework for a library of code for Angular. If you go into the TS file, the update component TS file. See, it refers to search and NGB type ahead. So over here, let's go down and let's see, we've got a search in here somewhere. Or did you pull, maybe we didn't, maybe it's not working on yours yet because I didn't pull it yet. I added the code here to have the search. Oh yeah, if you get the latest code from Git, yeah, scroll up a little bit. Now we have a function on 97. This is a kind of strange way to define a function. It doesn't look like the rest. That's how they had it in the example, so I left it that way. But that is a function called search. And that's the JavaScript stuff it does. I don't understand all of it. It's just what they said to do. You know, if we have any problems with it or something, I'd have to understand. But I did have to understand enough to notice on line 101. Line 101, notice it says states.filter. Do you see that? Yep. And if you look up at the top of the page, we have states defined. States is a big data structure. It looks a lot like JSON. That's actually its JavaScript syntax, but it's a list. See, it has brackets. JSON is very similar to JSON to JavaScript syntax in that, like, a list of things has these square brackets around it. So it's a list of states with commas between them. Fine. So it's filtering that list because down there, you could just tell without understanding all the code. You saw it said states.filter and then something something. I said, okay, so it's referring to this list because we named this list is named states. And it's filtering this list of states by the text the guy entered, apparently. And that framework, ng Bootstrap, provided some of the code it's using. So the HTML defined the layout, and it said, invoke this action. HTML was able to have a statement that says invoke some JavaScript or TypeScript when this occurs. But, HTML cannot directly do any processing. And what it does over here is it searches through the list of states and then displays for you which ones, match the criteria so we get the behavior we want. So anytime we're messing with user interface stuff, we'll be in a TS and or HTML file. HTML to change the layout, TS to do any processing we got to do. And there's references from the HTML to the TypeScript file.
Okay.
That's probably enough for now. This is Angular. It's in app, web apps, app. It has module files, which is just grouping of files, but it has a configuration that's that will be important eventually. It has a module concept, but the main thing I guess you'd be looking for are components related to screens, and there'll be usually a CS and an HTML file for each.
Okay.
Now, if you want get a chance to watch the Angular videos, they'll walk through this in more detail, a lot more, some of this, and then you might be able to look in here when they're talking about certain things and see where it is in our code. I mean, similar things. They'll have a different example, right? But they'll be talking about what are modules for and what's at component mean and what's export class. They'll talk and describe that, and you can come over here and see, oh yeah, I'm doing that. We have that here.
Okay.
Okay. So, yeah, I guess that's good for now. I think that's probably enough. And it sinks in over time. You hear it, you look at it, you get a little more comfortable thinking about it. And it'll start making more sense to you. See right there, also, you can see right there that the TypeScript file on line 81 is referring to the HTML file. That's how Angular knows what HTML file to display. Really, the JavaScript is all the control Yeah, it does all the processing, including when you first try to navigate to a web page. This TypeScript code gets executed, and it knows here Angular has defined this structure with the at component, and it says if you can tell me a variable named template URL, then and dot slash means in the same directory in the file system, which is where that is, right? Here's the HTML. I want this HTML file to be displayed. You can name that HTML file anything you want, just as long as it's referred to in line 81 as template URL. But we try to make it easy for us to see and find by naming them the same, just changing their extension from HTML and CSS. But right there is why the HTML file gets displayed, is because the TypeScript file refers to it on line 81.
Okay.
So the real definition of the code for the component is on line 83. A class is like a blueprint for a structure of we call it an object. It's a grouping of code for some purpose. Like one or more functions are grouped into a class. And so that might take a while to make much sense. But a class is kind of a grouping of code. It's in its file, but inside here, Angular will be looking for a class to find the beginning of the code to be executed that it needs to run in here. And an add component is kind of configuration on that class host request update component. And it says, oh, this is an Angular component because I put add component on it. And here's like it's a list of some properties. I want to set like template URL, like where's the HTML you want me to display. And if we do that, if you look up the documentation for Angular, it says this is what template URL is for. Here's what at component is for. One thing you might do, you get a chance, without even the videos, once you go to a web page, just any web page, and search for Angular, search for Yarn. A lot of these tools search for Markdown. You can go to the page, read about a paragraph or two, and sometimes get somewhat of an idea of it. Go to Angular. Yes, Angular.io is the main definition of Angular by Google. They made this, and they have a team that supports it and everything. Getting started, it'll talk about it and stuff. What is Angular? Gives you a summary. Getting started will tell you how to get around it. Tutorials, so you can browse through it. You browse around just for a few minutes, you'll start getting an idea of what some of it's for, and you come back to look at it more later. Look for Yarn. We have a silly name, Yarn. Isn't that kind of a weird name? Seems like to me. Of course, Angular's kind of weird too, but we've got a lot of weird names. Yarn, that's not it. Install Yarn. Maybe that was it up there, Yarn package. That might have been it up there, I guess. That was Yarn, wasn't it? Yarn package. I guess it is called Yarn package. Yarn caches packages, it downloads. If you click on Get Started, maybe it gives you a page that'll introduce you to it some. It's a nice looking web page, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Pretty. Install. Right there, it doesn't tell you much right off what it's for, does it? Click on Get Started at the bottom. Okay, or at the top, that'll be fine too. There you go. There you go. Yarn is a package manager for your code. It allows you to use and share code with other developers. It's the thing that pulls your code down from other, if you make code that you want other people to use, like ng bootstrap, so whoever wrote that now Yarn will pull those down and put it in the node modules directory and run it for you. Notice it refers to package.json that it looks at down below there in that text. So, but a page like this, about a paragraph or two, about any of these topics that we mentioned, that you look at, and you start getting a feel for what's Angular for, what's TypeScript for, what is HTML for, and now you have enough knowledge to know when you need to get into something, where to go find more information. So you need to, if you need to work, if you're going to try to make a change, you get an idea if you need to be working in the HTML file or a TS file or what, by just having an idea what each of them, how they all fit together. Markdown, you can search for Markdown. Markdown will just describe the syntax of Markdown for you, which is what our README file is in. Got some videos on it. Markdown cheat sheet shows you the brief definition, the summary. The first one will just show you the layout. Scroll down a little bit further. There you go. See headers. It shows you. See under headers. Scroll down. It shows you. Here's what it will look like. Alternative ways. If you do pound H1, pound H2, header level 2. Scroll down a little further. There's the output of those commands H1, H2, because that pound sign is defining the header level. Pound some text, pound is a fourth level header. Scroll down on the page a little further. Emphasis is bold or italic or underscore around stuff. If you scroll down, it will show you how it showed up. See how the bold is done because they put two asterisks around a word. One asterisk around it, it makes it italic syntax, but two around it makes it bold, like on line 2. Mm-hmm. So you just start looking at, so know where things are and just go find them when you need to, but a good idea. All right.
All right.
Okay. Well, I'll good luck with getting the others up to speed today, just on their setup.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's see if I can